Good evening, Prague. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you today. As you can see, my talk today is about how Bitcoin solves the world's biggest problem. I have 18 minutes, so we better get started. This is me in 2015. I still have some hair. This is when the Austrian government got back the gold from other countries where it was stored after World War II. Germany did the same, but we only got half the gold back. Why did we get half the gold back, and why and how does this relate to magic internet money? Remember this graphic, we'll see it again at the end. It all starts with the Romans, like everything starts with the Romans. It's the first time that we have organized inflation, the organized debasement of money over many hundreds of years, obviously. It's not very noticeable for one generation, but over generations you notice, and you get the first of 5 lessons that I have for you today. I have 5 lessons and 1 conclusion. When you look at the history of inflation, the history of debasement, the history of governments abusing their power, lesson number 1 is when empires control money, they abuse it to fund themselves. Some here will know that this is of course happening today, as it's been happening over history. When we look at the history of the dominant money, of the international reserve currency, if you want, you see lots of precious metals, mostly gold. And when you go to the last one, it's actually made of paper, which is weird. I give you that, but we'll come to that. So from the Roman times, we went to the dark times, and then we ended up in the 19th century with the classical gold standard. Gold bugs, some of you who have been here in the morning know that I was a gold bug, and I still own gold. I still like gold, it's shiny. Gold bugs love to talk about the classical gold standard because it was hard money, and global trade thrived in the 19th century on this hard money standard. But, and this is crucial, it relied on physical settlement. You had to move the gold around. Maybe even, today you would do it in planes. Back then you did it in ships. Put some gold in a wooden ship. That's only a good idea if the ship actually reaches its destination. And of course, trust in central banks, something we all love, trust in central banks. Well, in World War I, the gold standard was broken. It never really returned. Trust fails under stress. So we talk about the First World War, and we have our second lesson. Physical neutrality does exist, but political neutrality, if it exists, does not last. Between the wars, we saw some countries trying to get back to the gold standard. Britain famously got back, but at the wrong rate of exchange. And the US also tried to join the party by taking away the people's gold. By the way, of course, statistics say it was only 1/3 of all the gold that was actually delivered. So it's not like everybody just ran to the government to give them their gold, but this is the famous executive order of the US government seizing Americans' gold, the executive order that has also been referenced at least by Satoshi Nakamoto in his birth date. The gold standard was dropped regardless, and it was in complete shambles by the end of the 1930s. And then, of course, World War II started and ended again with Japan and Asia being in ruins, most of Russia being in ruins, Europe being completely destroyed, and only one country remained intact, and that was, of course, the United States of America. In Bretton Woods, and many of you have heard about this, in 1944, everybody got together, everybody brought their ideas. For example, on the right we have the famous economist John Maynard Keynes coming from Britain, and on the left we have Harry Dexter White, American, who was in charge of the negotiations for the Americans. So Keynes said, well, we are not the reserve currency anymore, the pound is not the reserve currency anymore, so how about that now that we cannot be the reserve currency anymore, how about nobody gets to do the reserve currency? How about we do some sort of international central bank, and we trust in the international central bank, and I have some friends who could run it, no problem. And Harry Dexter White said, well, yeah, Sir Keynes, that's a very good idea, Lord Keynes, but let's not do that. We go back to some sort of gold standard. We will base the dollar on gold, but everybody else will be based on the dollar, which has the positive side effect for everybody else to just be able to stack dollars instead of the actual gold, the actual physical gold. It was a very important step away from settlement in the physical gold. It was, and that is absolutely true, Jack Mellors will maybe talk about this even. He talks about this in his videos, and he's right. It was also a way by the Americans to basically finance the rebuilding of Europe and Asia, Japan especially. This was not only in their interest, it was in the interest of everyone. But as we will learn, these interests change. Of course, we get new bureaucracies immediately because the system of Bretton Woods is not a very good system, and it started breaking the day it was founded. So we get the World Bank, the nice aunt who gives you presents at Christmas, and then we have the International Monetary Fund. Those are the guys who will break your knees if you don't pay up. And you have Robert Triffin. He's a Belgian-born American economist who, at the end of the 60s, will tell America, or the end of the 50s, will tell America, listen, guys, this was not a bad idea. Printing the world's money is not a bad idea. But there is a problem, and economists know it as the Triffin dilemma. The problem is this: you have to export the paper in order to get the real stuff in, meaning you have to run a trade deficit, meaning that your industry will not be able to compete with German industry, Japanese industry, and that's exactly what we saw during the 60s and 70s and even the 50s. It's also what President Trump is talking about when he says he wants to get the American production base back. It's part of that. It's part of that. Of course, the Europeans never saw it as a one-sided thing and didn't really like the whole idea of the dollar being the world reserve currency. Charles de Gaulle, he never really trusted the Americans, French president, general before that, and he sent warships to New York to get the French gold from New York. The Germans, by the way, did not do that. They just trusted the Americans. That's another story for another day. And Charles de Gaulle, or his finance minister, they also coined the term exorbitant privilege for the privilege of printing the money and getting the stuff. But, as I said, this was a system that did work well for actually building back up countries like France and Europe. It's never easy. It's never simple. It's never black and white in these things. So Charles de Gaulle gets the gold back. What do the Americans do? They shut the gold window. They decide, no, it's time to not get any gold out of the country anymore. We still have 8,000 tons. The dollar is now not convertible into gold anymore. That's, of course, Richard Nixon. So lesson number 3, even a gold-backed system becomes politicized if controlled by one state. Now we move into the exciting times of the 1970s. The gold price explodes and inflation explodes all over the world. Why? Because shutting down the gold window and repegging the dollar at a higher gold price is effectively devaluing the dollar. So anybody who got the dollars before and would convert them to gold in order to store the gold had a bad deal. Especially the Arab states who were supporting America with their energy. They sold energy at some rate. Now the dollar is worth less. They said, well, how about giving us more money? So they raised the price of oil. We had energy crisis in Europe. We discovered the joy of the car-free Sunday in Germany and Austria. Americans, and this is very important, Americans always have a play. They always have some sort of ploy that they can come up with. And Nixon was very, very, very good at this. So what did he do? He did 2 things. The first, now, when I started researching all of this, talking about the petrodollar was basically a crazy conspiracy theory. Now it's, there's Bloomberg articles and we know about this. But it's only one of 2 things. So the first thing is he goes to Saudi Arabia, he strikes a deal with Saudi Arabia. From then on, oil gets only sold for dollars, and you get usage demand for the dollar. So basically, very basically, the dollar gets backed by oil instead of gold. Gold, the most important commodity of the 19th century, oil, the most important commodity of the 20th century. Well, guess what the most important commodity of the 21st century is? But it wasn't only that. China back then was a backwater. The Americans didn't even recognize it. They said Taiwan is the actual China. Nixon changed that. He went to China and said, hey, I have an idea. We show you how to do business. You build up your production. We do the same thing with you that we did with the Europeans and with the Japanese after World War II. Instead, and in return, you recycle the dollars into our debt. We will be happy. You are happy. It's all good. And then Volcker in 1980, the Fed chairman, he did something that Triffin understood. He actually he actually raised the rates to 20%, and he put America into a recession. So they decided back then that the international role of the dollar is more important than the domestic economy. In the 1980s and 90s, we saw the financialization of the economy. We saw Gordon Gekko, greed is good. Suddenly the banks are the biggest houses, the biggest buildings in every city. Why? Because inflation really started from that point on. Backed by the petroleum from the Arab states and backed by the Chinese manufacturing boom. Lesson 4, and we will see this especially in the next couple of decades that we are covering. Fiat reserves, currencies are tools of political power. With the dollar as a fiat reserve currency firmly in place, we enter the 1980s, and Friedrich August von Hayek, the Austrian-born economist, quoted or said this famous quote that we all have heard about before in our Bitcoin journey. I don't believe we shall ever have a good money again before we take the thing out of the hands of government. That is, we can't take it violently out of the hands of government. All we can do is by some sly roundabout way introduce something they can't stop. Well, now it's going to get interesting. The Europeans actually had the same idea. They wanted to introduce something the Americans can't stop and came up with a fiat currency that is not linked to gold, but backed by gold, actually 13,000 tons of gold. Europe has more gold than the Americans. The official statistics don't do this justice, came up with the euro. And for a very short period of time, the world actually looked at the euro and said, well, this is different than the dollar. We can use this. We trust the Europeans more than the Americans, and if there's one central bank and there's like 10 different countries and 10 different governments, then the central bank is actually more independent and can actually look at the price stability. So after the euro was launched, the American stock market crashed, the dot-com crash, and countries did the unthinkable. They started moving to the euro. Saddam Hussein started selling his oil for euro. First, the Americans said that's a bad idea, but it turned out for him, for at least a year, it worked out really well, short term. There was also other Muslim nations who advocated dumping the dollar for the euro, something that we will see later with China and Russia even. And then in 2000, this was also, of course, cut short by the wars in Afghanistan, especially Iraq, but it, in my opinion, was one of the reasons why Germany and France did not join the war effort of the Americans in Iraq. We go even further. We go to the next financial crisis, the Lehman crisis, the great financial crisis. Shortly after that, it was the Chinese suddenly growing a pair and telling the world that they want another form of international money. And in 2010, which for today seems like a decade, more than a decade ago, it seems like an eternity ago, it was Putin who said that Russia will actually join the euro one day. Can you imagine that? The euro wouldn't only be energy currency, would be the currency of one of the most important energy producers in the world. Well, after the Europeans decided to go with the Americans after, and censoring Russian currency reserves, all of this broke down. China is not using the euro anymore and trade with Russia. Russia is not using the euro anymore. Russia actually got rid of all their dollars, so used the euro, now they got rid of all the euros. So Christine Lagarde, she's in a very, very tough spot right now. She thinks that probably thinks or implies that censoring the Russian currency reserves wasn't the best idea from the euro's perspective, but politically, of course, it's understandable. So that's where we stand right now. When it comes to international reserve currencies, the dollar is Coca-Cola. The euro was supposed to be Pepsi, but now it's just Coke Zero. So the euro tried to be neutral, but it lacks military political unity, and it also added some censorship on top of it. I didn't even talk about the yuan and the BRICS currency. I would forget about all of this. This is not happening. This is just, mind games. There's trust issues, there's capital controls, there's state surveillance. Nobody's going to store their money in the yuan long term. And then we have gold again, but gold didn't change. Gold is still physical, it's still centralized, and it's still hard to transport and store. And this is the fifth and last lesson for my talk today. Every alternative fails on neutrality, openness, and trust. Now, I said one of the options is going back to gold, and this is literally the only thing that central banks know about. So what do? They buy more gold. This is what the gold buying looks like, starting with net gold buying by international central banks, starting with the international financial crisis. I think it's important to understand that in 2008 and 2007, when Lehman Brothers collapsed, basically, there was a couple of days where the financial world just stood still, had a heart attack. And governments around the world realized that they need some sort of neutral reserve asset. And they also need it within their borders. That's why you saw the first slide, you saw me, a little bit more hair. You saw me with the gold bars in the vault of the Austrian National Bank. Remember, we only got back half the gold. So now with Trump and everything going on, what do the Germans do? They're getting back the other half of their gold. And I can tell you with absolute certainty, more certainty than I can tell you that Bitcoin is only 21 million, that whatever the Germans do, the Austrian government will do 1 year later. Satoshi Nakamoto has this quote, and I think it's one of the most important quotes from him because it actually solidifies the idea of this digital gold narrative. As a thought experiment, imagine that there was a base metal as scarce as gold, but with the following properties. Boring gray in color, not good conductor of electricity, not particularly strong, not useful for any practical or ornamental purposes, but with one special magical property. It can be transported over a communications channel like the internet. And when we look at this in these 4 categories, neutral, portable, censorship resistant, and trustlessness, there's only one asset in the world that has a green dot on every single category. And if you compare it to gold, you see that gold has other problems than fiat. Only Bitcoin can solve the problem of fiat and gold, that the fiat and gold are solving, but not perfectly. So this is my message today. For centuries, the world has searched for a money that no king, no empire, no politician can control or debase. Bitcoin is not perfect, but for the first time in history, we might have found it. And this, ladies and gentlemen, this, my friends in Prague, is how we end up with magic internet money. Thank you very much.
Secure your BTC Prague 2026 ticket at the lowest possible price now.